hello everyone, and welcome to our Winston Innovation Lab Common Sense Media presentation on supporting healthy tech use at home. I am Michele Heimbauer, Associate Director of the Winston Innovation Lab. With me is Jaclyn Baharestani, Winston Innovation Lab Special Project Coordinator. And we are excited to introduce Lisa Solomon, Common Sense Media's Head of Connected Schools Program. And we're thrilled to have Jeremy Antar, our New York Winston Transitions Head of School, join us this year as well. Lisa and Jeremy, we want to thank you both for leading this important conversation. And thank you also to those of you who have submitted questions when registering. We did our best to integrate your questions into the presentation, but feel free to submit additional questions via the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that as well as the chat. And we're planning to have some time to respond to questions towards the end of the hour. And we're also going to be sharing the recording of this presentation as well as providing access to the slides, as they are going to be chock full of information that you might want to review, as well as links to helpful resources. If you have any questions at any point after the presentation or would like to discuss your child individually, please feel free to reach out to me or your campus leadership. Before we get started, I just want to share how much we value our partners at Common Sense Media and the work they are committed to doing. Same as the work we do at Winston Prep, Common Sense Media's work is research-driven and very much aligned with Winston Prep's social-emotional framework of the qualities of a sustainable and independent learner. Their resources and research support our teachers and leaders in their efforts to help our students learn how to develop the social-emotional skills, awareness, and knowledge needed to navigate the digital space at school successfully. So we're really excited to have this opportunity to directly share the benefits of our long-standing partnership with Common Sense Media to answer your questions and to help build your own understanding of wellness in the digital space. Okay, handing it over to you, Lisa.
Hi, everybody, and I want to encourage you all to jump in the chat as well. Jaclyn will definitely be monitoring that in real time. And I just wanted to welcome you all and say I'm delighted to be here. And Jeremy may pop in as well to offer some comments as well. So we can go to the next slide, please. That's me. And I really do encourage you to take down my email. You are really welcome to check in with me. If you have questions we do not address during this session, you are always willing to touch base. If you're trying to find certain resources and you're like, hey, I can't find it anywhere because we are a nonprofit and sometimes the site can be a little tricky, please reach out and let me know how I can support you and your family in the best way possible. Next slide, please. So I always put this up and it's sort of just, I want to first just give everybody a moment just to take a deep breath and to pat yourself on the back for even being here and taking some time out of what I'm sure was an extremely busy day. I think unless you've been living under a rock, you've been hearing about the anxious generational summer, you've been seeing headlines, you've been hearing about social media limits and how we all need to change our phone use. Everything is going on. It can be a little overwhelming. And I think we all want to feel like we have that suit of armor, but sometimes we may feel like we're stuck in the mud. I just want to say part of the process is just being here and hearing about all these options and things that you can proactively do. My goal is that you come away from this event with at least 2 or 3 actionable items. I always do remind families, though, I used to come away from these parent events and go home and then spend the next hour telling my kids all the things we were going to change and make better. And they would maybe hear the first 3 minutes of my conversation and hear nothing else. So don't put so much pressure on yourself. If you come away with a few great nuggets tonight, that's what we want you to do. And just take a deep breath. Next slide, please. I will take a deep breath too. If you are not familiar with Common Sense, I only share this slide just to let you see sort of our progression. When we started 20 years ago, there really weren't iPhones. iPhones came around in 2007. So we've just seen how things have changed so dramatically from just looking at sort of content, for those of you that remember maybe Tipper Gore and her movement around content and stuff, to now we're dealing with AI. there's just been a massive shift in what technology is doing. No surprise to you guys, but I just want you to know sort of Common Sense as a nonprofit has been trying all along the way, as Michele noted, with research and all sorts of resources as well for educators and for families to help meet this moment and support you as you are traveling in your parenting journey. Next slide, please. So as Michele mentioned, we've had a longstanding relationship with Winston Preparatory School. We're so grateful. And what it means is you support our nonprofit, and in return, you just get a few extra benefits. Most everything on the Common Sense website is free. I just want to stress that. We also have a lot of materials now in Spanish and other languages. So we work very hard in accessibility and inclusion. But just know that this conversation tonight is one of the benefits of our relationship. And we're really grateful for your support from all your campuses. Okay, next slide, please. So I always like to start with our most recent research out of our quite prolific research department. We recently had something on generative AI. This came out on October 10th, and really it's focusing more on tweens and teens. I'm sure some of you have middle schoolers or you might have younger kids, but this is just kind of interesting to note. There is a QR code if you want to read the full report. I'm not going to go super deep dive into this because you can read it on your own, but what it does, it just lets us know sort of our teens are stressed and feeling a bit burned out and the impact of social media on them. So the next slide, please. This was talking to 13 to 17-year-olds, and basically, not really surprising, a lot of kids were feeling very burned out, and we asked them sort of categories, and you can see it's everything from trying to have a game plan to their future. I personally have 2 kids in college now, so I'm on the other side of this arc, but I absolutely saw this going on in our house. 56% were feeling pressure to have sort of a future life path figured out. We also looked at the achievement culture, how they feel about their appearance, social life, friendships, and then activism. And we did find social media plays a dual role, as do parents, meaning there's some really good elements of it and there's some not so great elements of it. So it's not giving you a black and white answer, but it is providing some really interesting insights. And what we did also find is the attention, I think, for adults as well to self-care and how important that is sort of shifting the narrative because no one seems to be getting enough sleep. So the next slide, please, just provides some what helps. If you want to go in and sort of read through the whole methodology and all that, it's all on our site, on the research site. I can put it in the chat in a little while, but basically what the research says is to help combat this feeling of grind and burnout with our teens. And I think it's also starting in our tweens. It's just they have to get enough sleep, spending more time outdoors, having more open scheduling, feeling less restrictive. So like every minute is not scheduled down to the 12th hour of the day, and just to provide more flexibility. What we also did see was just how important it is. And so again, kudos for being here. Just the adults in their lives and their trusted adults can really help kids better manage what they're doing, make decisions that might prevent overload, and can sort of look at the efforts, not just the outcome, which I'm sure definitely resonated with me as a parent. I thought that a lot, and to appreciate their friendships and talk to them about their social media use. And sometimes we can assume it's all bad, and it's not, because they are making connections and things like that. So I just lay this out here as sort of to dip your toe in the water to see what some of the research is saying, and please do go check it out. We did this in collaboration with the Harvard Graduate School of Education as well. And so they have a lot of really good insights as part of the research project on what parents can do. And maybe we'll have another session and just look at that for our parents of high schoolers, because I think there's a lot of really interesting information in there. So to that point, Common Sense has everything for kindergartners to 12th graders. We have a ton of video guidance. We just recently had this talk about a turning point, sort of the push-pull of tech in our lives for our kids, whether it's like cell phone bans or looking at AI, and there's just a whole spectrum. So if you want to watch any of that, the whole playlist is connected there. And we have another really great event coming up on December 10th, which will actually use that grind pressures research as the jumping off point, with one of the authors, Dr. Emily Weinstein of Harvard, and then Jennifer Wallace, who's written a great book as well about sort of the achievement culture. So I'm sure that you will be getting that from your school. Maybe in the next week or two, we'll send out information. But also know we have these great 6-minute videos. I put my 2 favorite up here, one about kids in tech. If your child does not yet have a phone, this just gives you really good guidance on things to consider in just 6 minutes if you want to make those choices. And then also another one I put is just about screen time. One of the number one questions I often get from parents is about screen time. Sort of how much is too much? The conversation has changed, in my opinion, radically since after COVID. Before we were sort of counting the minutes. Now what we're really looking at is more of intentional tech use instead of the minutes used, and what are our kids doing online, and what's more creative and innovative versus just doom scrolling. So I just want to know that these are here, and these all have active hot links to view later. As Michelle said, she will send out the slide deck as well. Next slide, please. So I want to share, and you can see the Center for Digital Thriving there on the slide as well at Harvard. We collaborate with them. This is actually pulled from one of our lessons that we share with 6th to 12th graders, but we often like to take some of these lessons and share them with parents. And Jeremy, I want you to jump in here when appropriate as well. What we're doing really is I'm trying to give everybody sort of a gut check on what are your values in your family and your home with your kids, and how are those impacted both positive and negatively by our tech use. And these are things we can do in the classroom. These are things we can do with our kids. They're just great conversation starters too, if you're not sure where to dive in. So next slide, please. So this is I'm just going to really quickly run through vocab. And again, this is what your students would be seeing if they're shared this lesson. But what is digital well-being? And you can all read that. Experiencing media and tech in a way that supports one's mental, physical, social, and emotional health. And so the next slide provides an essential question. So what are my values, and how do media and tech impact them? So this just gives us the ability to step back, and then we here has another key vocabulary of what's a value, which I think most of you know. So principles or rules that are important as we live our lives, that help shape our identity, our culture, experiences, and things like that. And then the next slide, I think. So we have some directions. Jeremy, did you want to share anything here, or do you want me just to keep going? Because I'd love your input on this.
Yeah, I think, so for our students, for our kids, so much of when we're trying to teach is having them understand and explaining the why to them. So I think, going over values is a great opportunity to help them make that connection as to why we're having this conversation, why we're talking about any limits, why we're talking about rules, and to have it be an anchor for those conversations that you can pull back to. There's a consistency, so it won't just be one conversation. It could be something that's revisited as these are the values and this is the reason why. And so you're making a strong connection. And I think also just it provides an opportunity to self-reflect and just to reflect on something that for the most part, social media use, and for our kids, it's just really stimulus response, right? It's just responding in the moment. And unless directed, there's really not a lot of opportunity to pause and think about and reflect on, how you feel before, during, after, using different aspects of social media. And that can be really valuable. And I think, again, as part of that conversation, the values can be worked into that. So students are reflecting during the school day on different things that they're doing at school, but sometimes, that it's harder to do that at home, and you have to be really purposeful about it. But I think that reflection and the feelings that they have, really tapping into that, can be really valuable, right? So I think reinforcing and teaching, our kids that our emotions and the feelings they're having are information, and they're there to guide us. They're giving us some good information. If by reflecting, you recognize that you feel kind of, crummy sometimes after you use something on social media, or, that's really good information. And I think to teach that angle of, that's good information for you, and let's connect that to our values and lead that to some of the conversations we're going to have about behavior, right? So the choices we're going to make, the behavior we're going to make, it's going to be, it's going to be based on this stuff that we're talking about. So there's some purpose to it.
Yeah, and I love that. And also what we're trying to do, and I think I've heard this from your community as well, we're trying to raise independent kids, right? And kids that can have impulse control at some point when they're maybe leaving our house and are making good choices. So we're playing the long game. And I think sometimes when we identify some of these values and can share those with our kids, when we're in those moments where you're trying to get a phone or trying to get someone off tech, or, I could never get the game controller out of my son's hands when he was in middle school. When you can talk back to some of these key core values, like Jeremy was saying, it helps you a little more with the why. So we don't have to go into this in detail, but I just want you to see the directions are, we're going to show you in a minute, just sort of a bunch of values. You can add one if you don't see one that speaks to you. And then just pick, usually we say 3, but just for these purposes tonight, I was just going to say pick 2 of your top values for this moment in time. So Michelle, if you could just show us the next slide, that'd be great. So we have everything from authenticity to balance to gratitude. I had a 12th grader on one of the talks add music, because music was really important to this child and sort of how it connects with them. So just maybe take a look at this and give it a think. We'll leave it for just a few minutes. If anybody sort of connects with any of these or wants to add any, feel free to add anything in the chat as well. And basically, so I always have 2 that I love here, which I can share in a minute. But if you take, I think we can go to the next slide, because what we want to do is talk about, if you're willing to share, otherwise we can do it amongst ourselves, but sort of share your top 2 values and then which ones resonate with you, right? So personally, mine are with connectedness and physical health. And you can see those. So connection, because my kids are at college and I really like to make sure I'm in touch with them. And then physical health, because I was pretty sick for the past few years. So it's really important for me now to be healthy and stay healthy. So those are my 2. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. And then we can move to the next part of this exercise, and then we'll move on to the tips and tricks.
Lisa, I too put connection, as well as gratitude. And I felt like presence kind of went into gratitude for me, but I only picked 2. But that kind of just represents where I am with my family and my parenting journey. And just, I intentionally chose connection in light of this conversation. It's really sort of real-time connection, in person, genuine, authentic connection.
Yeah, I love those. And also these can change over time, like you just said, these totally can change over time depending what's happening in your life or in your kids' lives or at home. So the next part of this process would be, and Jeremy or Michelle, feel free to jump in if you want to, but the next piece of this, and maybe you want to talk about here, is to take a moment to maybe write down, and if we do these in person sometime, you just take Post-it notes, and that's a really fun way to do it. You can do it around the dinner table, which is really a nice activity to do as well, is just write down sort of your top 3 digital activities, so things you do online, right? And then determine which of these digital activities supports or hinders your values. And then maybe think about what you might be able to do in your own life to adjust those to align better with your values, right? So I often doom scroll occasionally in the evenings. And obviously that is really not good for physical health when I should be getting up and going and walking around the block, right? So maybe I could go take a walk and read the news while I'm walking, as long as I don't walk into a tree. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about this. Connectedness for me, I often am online FaceTiming perhaps with my kids. And that's actually a really positive thing. It's how I get in touch with them in college and keep up to date on what they're doing. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, but there's a lot of ways you can sort of think about these values and then what you're doing online as adults, because we're always modeling behavior for our kids, right? And thinking about how to change things and then having those conversations with your kids, right? Like, I noticed you're gaming a lot. So maybe what's the trade-off here? What are some things, if we want to talk about connectedness as a family, what could we do that maybe supports that better? Does anyone want to jump in here about this process and share any ideas or reflections, or maybe ways you could take this into your own home and rely on something like this to help shape conversations?
I just want to share, I think, to your point, Lisa, verbalizing it and saying out loud, that's something at Winston, and, we always talk about that as teachers, is matching not just, what's on the board, but verbalizing the approach, sort of modeling both with your words and with your actions. And I think that can be really helpful. You're providing more opportunities, for your children to learn from you. You're explaining if you are purposely putting your phone in the other room because we're going to go play in this room, we do a puzzle in this room, we do your homework there. Like, I'm going to put my phone in this room so that it's not within earshot of me, and you're doing that for a purpose. And I think also just when you're talking about values, sometimes connecting like your identity to that can be really valuable. So saying like, it's a little easier to adjust your behavior when that's the case, of saying like, I'm someone that, one of our values is, to your point about like going for a walk, one of our values is physical health or health. So, that makes the decision sort of for me as to why we're going to be going for a walk after dinner, because if that's who I am, then this is what I do. And it's not something where, you're feeling forced to do it. It's a have to. It's more of like, I get to do this to be in line and consistent with my values.
I love that. And something else, one of the values is kindness. And I always share this story, so apologies if you've heard this from me, but when my daughter was younger, I was posting pictures because I have friends sort of that live all over the place. And I was posting a photo of her. And one of our values at that point was kindness. And she did not like the photo I was posting about her. She thought it was unkind. And so we had a long conversation, and I had her go through and pick a photo that she approved. But I think what I found from that process is, to this day, I think about that. And she now does this in college. If someone posts a picture of her at a bar that she does not want to have posted, she makes her friends take it down. They all sort of check each other to make sure that you're being kind. If you're doing something online that I don't think is fair or kind, please take it down. And it's been a cultural shift in our house that happened since I think she was in 5th grade or 6th grade. And just like, watch those moments, because they're pretty powerful. And you can learn so much from your kids and what they are doing, right? And what they like to do online. And I just always share that as a teachable moment, because it was really a teachable moment for me. So does anyone else have anything on this? Otherwise, we can continue. I'm keeping an eye on time. But we can send this actual lesson. It's embedded in the slides. So if you decide there is a take-home activity, you could print it out and do it in your own home, and it's super easy and fun. And if you are also going to pair this with a family media tech planner, it just gives you some great conversations to have around the table when people have a little time and breath, maybe over Thanksgiving or something like that.
I just want to add, I think it's great, and purposeful to use the word habits here and think of it as habits. Because, I think that's very significant, and that leads to the point, kind of taking from, I don't know if anyone's read Atomic Habits, James Clear's book, his book, but when talking about forming habits, and I think thinking of that word, right, like we were talking about, it's not just doing something one time. You're not just saying, oh, I'm going to, I'm doing this right now with this goal, but saying like, I know the example in that book is the language when you tie it into your identity. If someone's value is physical health, they don't just say, I'm going to go for a run. It's, I'm a runner. This is what I do, right? It's sort of wrapped into your identity, and that makes it so much easier to stick with those things when you think of them as, I'm forming habits. I'm not just going to try to isolate like, okay, 3 days this week, I'm just going to try to put my phone away. You're thinking of it more as a sustaining habit and behavior change, and tying it to, again, who you are. This is who you want to be. And, your actions then become who you are.
I love that. And habits also, like, you can try also things for a week. Jeremy, I don't know if you agree with this, but you can say to your kids, like, we're going to take all the phones out of the room. You're going to wake up to a simple alarm clock, and I'm going to do it too. So the first thing I don't do is pick up my phone, and let's see how it feels for a week, right? Because doesn't it take, I think, 3 weeks to change a habit or to create a new habit? I think that's the timing, but it's really fun to sort of play around these things with your kids and try to think about the habits and maybe the things that work and don't work, because do-overs and changing things up if they are not working are okay. And every common sense believes, and I know Winston does as well, every child is different. How we parent and educate every child can be very different depending on their needs and their habits and their dispositions. So I think we're all pretty aligned in this conversation. And I wish I had a silver bullet to say you do this and it all goes away and gets better, but it's really about being involved in what your kids are doing online and understanding what they're getting in the classroom and then trying to support that at home as well. So next slide, please. So we're out of that. We're just going to give you some top tips now, and I want to make sure we have time for conversation. And please jump in if there's any more, if I'm missing anything. So we already kind of touched on this, but it's just talking about listening and engaging with our kids about what they are doing online. And from the smallest child who may be taking your phone and want to play a game to your senior in high school where sort of the horse is out of the barn, but you kind of still want to understand what they're up to. It's just a good idea to check in with them and to understand what they're doing and to know their technology and what they love to do. I always talk about the game Zelda, because my kids, I found that was a way for them to play together and they could get in and out of the game and they had to work together to achieve in the game, which was really fun. There was no winners and losers. So just talk to them about what they like to do. We always have this quote from a common sense focus group about, you know, adults don't get it. They think I'm addicted to tech, but I'm just addicted to my friends. We do know there are some addictive issues around media and tech. I'm not trying to belittle that. So if you really do feel like there's a very big concern in your home that you need additional help with, please reach out for that help. Because that can very often happen, and we just want to make sure we're cognizant of that issue. Next slide, please. And Jeremy, jump in if I'm missing anything. So I just like to remind everybody, and again, we click to the ratings and reviews here. If you have not been on those on our site, there's a rubric we created with the Harvard Grad School of Education. There always looks the same. And so I use the word dispassionate, but we try to be sort of very objective when we lay out the ratings and reviews. And we review apps and video games and books and all sorts of things. And I just want you to know what your kids are doing. So if you're getting a new app or you're letting a new platform into your house, just go on the website and look at what the red flags are. Look how to set up the privacy controls and the settings. And also, it's always worth mentioning, and Michelle knows we always talk about COPPA, but it's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act that really kids under 13 shouldn't be on most social media sites. And now we also have AI platforms to look at. So I think ChatGPT says between 13 and 18, you have to have parental consent as well. They're changing all the time, but just know what the parameters are. And most of that has to do with sharing and selling data. But we are seeing so much more research there now about how some of these kids are just maybe not developmentally ready. You know, it's the limbic system and the brain myelination and everything. They may just not be ready for social media yet. It's a lot of pressure and can cause a lot of anxiety for a lot of kids. So just really think it through when you're deciding what platforms to let your kids on, and go take a look at Common Sense and just read the reviews and what we suggest in terms of age and stage. Does anyone want to throw anything in on this piece? No? Okay, next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit as well, and this came up in the values in tech, but setting limits and expectations. There's a tech planners that are hot linked here, where basically it's just, what is a family, what are our expectations and our values around media and tech use? I always suggest updating it regularly, especially if you're getting new, like let's say you're going to add Netflix to your home situation, so you know what everybody's doing. Let's say you're going to let one child get on a certain platform that's new. Before they get them, that is the time to have these conversations, to talk about the limits, to talk about your expectations, to talk about when you want your kids to turn them off. Like we saw at the top about research, sleep is really, really important. So if your kids are texting till the wee hours of the night, it's probably not great for their health. And there's a lot of ways to talk them through it and take the tech away or turn off the do not disturb, and just have very explicit conversations about that. You know, give them the language to tell their friends, my mom won't let me text after 10 o'clock, so I may not respond till the morning. Like there's a lot of ways, as Jeremy mentioned, to narrate these conversations and to role play them, because I sometimes assume our kids know how to manage all this, and they often don't. So if we can give them the language and the words and role play some of it, it's super, super helpful, in my opinion. So set limits and expectations that work for you and your family and for your kids.
Lisa, just to jump in for a quick second, I
Please.
also I think this is a really nice illustration of the connection between that value sharing conversation and where you can take it as a next step and how you can build in that language and tie it together. So I think we can all imagine this conversation we're looking at here and these types of, boundary setting and things like that being a little easier, a little simplified when you can tie them back to that values-based discussion. And when your kids have the opportunity to provide input on their values and you yourself have done that and you've sort of put meaning to these values, I think this is just a nice example of how that all ties together.
And to
Yeah, I
make it
really
family
appreciate that.
oriented too, as well, so the parents, and the adults and the older children are also following these kind of expectations. Like at my house, we have 8 p.m., whether you're my 20-year-old son or my 8-year-old daughter, 8 p.m., the screens are off and we're reading together. So everybody sits in the living room and everybody reads. And then at 8:30, it's bedtime and you can continue reading for a little bit if you want, but lights out, not for the 20-year-old, but for the 8-year-old and me. But that ties to our family value of balance and how that's all connected, because that sleep piece of it is so important for the balance piece. But it's
Yeah,
a ongoing conversation as well.
Totally. Thank you guys so much for sharing that. I appreciate it. It's just nice to see it in real time. And sometimes it won't work and you have to revisit it, right? And as your kids get older, the whole thing changes as well. So it's great to get your input on this as well and talk to one another, right? I learned so much from every time we have these meetings. I learn so much from you guys, and we also just share our little insights and nuggets when we have different kids of different ages. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to say it again. Please get in there and look at platform settings, and you can block content, especially for younger kids. I have a few things to show you later about the Apple products that they've added that are super helpful. There's so many different apps now to help you take a break. There's assistive technology. There's AI that can help kids set up how to study. I just saw these for a bunch of college kids that they use it to get a really great study schedule to help them get through that. I mean, there's just a lot of ways you can use devices or not use devices to help relieve some anxiety, right? And we have ultimate guides, which is the hot link down there, on everything from Roblox to Discord to Instagram to Snapchat. And I have been seeing like Instagram and Snapchat, a lot of these platforms are trying to add features that make them sort of more teen friendly, but I still don't think there's any substitute for really talking with our kids and ourselves and looking at all of our platforms and making sure things are set to private. There's just no reason they're not to be if they're on Discord or they're gaming and things like that. And reminding them to take a break and things. Jeremy, were you going to say something?
I just wanted to add, I mean, of course, we're all saying, this is, of course, a million times easier said than done. But I think, one of the things to also be aware of and to add on into what we are verbalizing and saying is just, being aware that, the first place that the kids' minds are going to go to is what they're losing from this, what they're missing out on, right? And we all have the cognitive bias of loss aversion, right? We're always going to think of what we're losing when something's taken away. And so I think calling direct attention to what they gain is really important, because their minds aren't going to automatically go there to say, again, they might not reject it. I mean, they might not accept it in the moment, but to acknowledge and say, you're gaining and highlight, you're gaining the opportunity to get more sleep and feel better tomorrow. You're gaining, there's so many things that they gain from this, the peace of mind. There's a lot of elements that they are gaining from it. So I think highlighting that is really important.
I love those examples, because you're right. This all sounds really Pollyanna on some level, but it just takes a lot of conversation. Like we keep saying, it's never one and done. I wish it were. It's not. So I love that trade-off piece about it is really great too. Next slide, please. And this is funny because I wrote this slide last year, but I think it's changing a lot. So tech is a privilege, not a right. And now there seems to be a real movement to reduce tech. So in many circumstances, it can be considered a privilege not to have your tech, right? But there is an equity piece to this that I always want to raise. Like, my kids always took a public bus to a public school here in LA, and they needed something to, I needed them to have some sort of phone. This was before dumb phones. But there's a lot of ways to look at this, but we really are trying to be so much more intentional about the tech we use. But let's say too, like, especially in all our different communities, some of the tech is life-changing for many of our kids. I have a child that has a very hard time reading a lot of dense material in college, and he uses some chat GPT to help go through some of the reading and help summarize it for him. He doesn't use it to write a paper, but it has been a game changer, and he's going to graduate this year. I mean, we talk a lot about these things. We explicitly talk about some of these texts and what they're good for and what they're not good for, right? And how they may help you and how they may not help you. So when your kids are younger, spot checks are okay, meaning I suggest what's called an app walk. One, I do think if you have kids and you're on some family sharing plan, which is a great thing, they need to get your approval anyway. If they're getting a new app or game or anything on their devices, make sure you just know what they're downloading. And that is where you can spot check. Hey, what do you like? What platforms are you using? Why is that one fun? Why is that not one, not so great? Do-overs are okay, as we said. And think about it like learning to drive, right? Learning to drive, you don't drive at 16. You have 2 years, you have to get a permit, you have to then take a certain number of lessons. Using this technology is very nuanced. And we kind of need to hold their hands through the process, depending on how old they are and what their limits are and what dispositions and habits they have. So I just want to stress that. And I know that's something you're extremely sensitive to also in the Winston community. So just something to consider. Next slide, please. And we've shared this before, but just screen time management strategies or device, it's not really managing time, it's sort of device management, is really think about if you need tech in the rooms at night. Like Michelle was saying, everyone's off tech at her house at a certain amount of time. Really think about your offline activities. We really recommend no screens at dinner, which I think most people have kind of gotten around. And there are do not disturb functions. There are timer functions like Pomodoro. You could say, you have this amount of time to do something. We're going to set the timers. And a lot of these phones have really interesting features now. You can turn off the color in your cell phone. You can turn it to grayscale through the accessibility options. Makes it a lot less fun to look at. And you can do that together with your kid and just show them the differences and how it attracts your attention. And it underscores this issue that technology companies have made a lot of this stuff to keep you on there and to get eyeballs and clicks. And that just is a great example to show that as when it's bright and shiny, you're more willing to hang on to it. Even as adults, even me, a lot late at night. So just FYI, just saying. Does anyone have anything to jump in here? Okay. So the next one is my favorite because during COVID, one of my kids became a master crochet artist, and we're coming up to Thanksgiving. I love StoryCorps. I'm always and I know you're doing this in the classroom too with intentional use, but really think about, again, back to habits and values. What are you doing online? To Jeremy's point, is it adding value or taking away? Really think about the creative stuff you can do with intentional tech. So StoryCorps is free. You can interview grandparents or special people over the Thanksgiving break. It's an online thing that gives you questions and then you could write it up. These are just wonderful ways to use technology and engage with people and create community. So I just like to share that as an example. Of course, sometimes you may be passively scrolling or your kids may be passively scrolling, but just think through what they're doing. And, again, to Jeremy's point, what are we losing out versus what are we gaining? So I just like to share that as well. Next slide. We're going to have time for talks. And then we've talked about this, but I really feel so strongly about just modeling behavior that you hope to see in your own kids. I always talk about when I was teaching my kids to drive and then they started yelling at me about running all the yellow lights, which I was habitually doing here, running yellow lights. And they called me every time now, and I've stopped doing it because they're driving. Do I want them to go through yellow lights? No, I do not. So just thinking about when you're, narrating, yes, I'm on the phone right now. I'll be getting off in a minute because I have to do this for work, and then I'll be back and we'll turn off, all the screens. I've heard some great suggestions from other families. One parent told me that her partner was having a really hard time getting offline. So they came up with a way where they would light a candle together, and everyone would know that when the candle was lit, even if it was for 15 minutes in the house, nobody was allowed to be on tech. Like, so you can find your own moments in your family and what resonates with everybody. There's just some great ideas on how to be intentional to get everyone aligned, and have teachable moments. There are millions right now of teachable moments. If you have older kids, there was a huge piece, I think, in today's New York Times about deep fake videos and how to tell if something's been AI generated. And there is so much stuff in the news just today about showing our kids what's fake, what's real, how to be critical thinkers. So just use the world to model behavior and to find teachable moments, because they are truly everywhere. I also suggest over the next few weeks to really check your news ingestion and what your kids are seeing and hearing in the news, because it's going to get kind of interesting over the next few weeks. And we just want to make sure that we are providing a filter and context for our children. Jeremy, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce, you said it, but just to reinforce with the modeling behavior and teachable moments, not only when you're successful, but also model and talk about when you're having a hard time or when you're not aligning with your values. I'm having a really hard time separating from my phone right now, or I'm scrolling on social media and it's really not helping me, so it's that they're not only seeing when you're successful with it and highlighting, that I'm so great at setting my boundaries, but you're also sharing moments when it's really hard for you. I think that, normalizes it. And I think, ingratiates them to sort of join you the next time that you're trying to set a boundary for them.
That's a great point. And also, I'm thinking in those moments when you're struggling, really kind of train yourself to think aloud. Like, I'm really struggling. I really want to just sit on the couch and scroll through Instagram, but I know that's not healthy, and I'm gonna take a walk around the block. Anybody want to come? Kind of thing. So talking through the struggle of it and your thought process of how you're pausing and thinking of a different coping mechanism to apply in the moment.
Yeah.
I love those. And also ask your kids. Like, we've done research too. A lot of kids will say, my parents they're online way too much, or they're not paying attention to me. Like, have a fun moment to both of what Jeremy and Michele just said. Ask your kids, like, what do I do online that's annoying to you? Or what habits do you think I should change? And you're empowering them and giving them a voice to tell you what to do differently. But sometimes you'll be really surprised at what they say, and then they sort of feel more involved in the process. So great input, you guys. Thanks so much. So the next slide is we mentioned modeling behavior, but I think I need to change this slide. It's a little redundant. Most important point here is talk with others in your community so you don't feel so alone. I can't stress that enough. When my kids were in elementary school, the parents of my friends' kids became just my closest allies. So if I was sending my child to their homes, we would have conversations ahead of time, normalizing conversations around, I always say if my kid had a peanut allergy and would go into anaphylaxis, I would definitely tell Michele, please do not give my child peanuts, right? Say the same thing about screens. Like, my child has a really hard time turning off a game. Can you guys please consider maybe not gaming or doing this? These are parameters to consider, just so that ahead of time, or what they're watching, right? If you have a kid there's scary movies and they don't like them and they watch something around Halloween, just to normalize these conversations and also learn from each other. Because so many people have so many great ideas that you may not be thinking about, and you could say, what works for you in this situation? I'm having a hard time. So, and also talk to grandparents and aunts and uncles. And, I have a brother that would continually show my kids not such great stuff when they were little. And he didn't mean to, but to this day, we still have conversations about it. My kids remember it. I won't tell you exactly what they were watching, but it could not have been less appropriate. And so we still have these conversations about stuff like that. Like, be really explicit with people about your expectations for your kids and what you want them to do. Also, that uncle turned out to be great to text with my kids now. So we started a text change so they could learn how to text in an appropriate way and kind of test drive texting with family members. And then you can see what's happening, or if they have questions or they're not sure what to say. It's just a really good way to sort of to try it out where the stakes are low and they can learn a lot from the process and engage with a family member who may not be living near you. Anyone else on that, please? Okay, I think so. The next ones we can go through, so we can definitely have time to have see if there's any questions. But we always get questions about parental controls. We've touched on this a little bit, but kids are super smart, and they can always get around parental controls or go to a friend's house and watch stuff that you may not let them watch. Which is just have conversations again. This is why we have these meetings, and we want you to talk about these issues with your kids. But I always suggest starting with the free options. Google has a safe search option. Apple has screen time and family sharing, and Android also has something called Family Link. These are wonderful, especially when your kids are smaller, and we have some guided tours of this in the next couple of slides. But use these resources. If you really are in a problem where you have smaller kids and you want to invest in something like Bark or Circle, there's Net Nanny, and Wirecutter at the New York Times shares a lot of their favorite ones as well. You can look at those, but just know that then you're going to have to manage them, right? So any of these technologies you bring in to manage stuff is great, but just know then you have to really be involved. And if you are giving your kids phones or certain platforms, you have to be involved in how you're managing those. We do link here to how do I decide which parental controls to use. And obviously these change as your kids get older. Does anyone want to jump in with any guidance here? Okay, so the next slide is, I think this is the one. Yeah, so this is cool, and this did not exist when my kids were younger. But there's assistive technology. There's an access trick if you go on your Apple phones. These are just for Apples. I apologize if you're an Android user, but we have a video below from a woman called Julia Storm here in LA who I really like, and she just walks you through how to do it. It's basically how to make your smartphone a dumb phone. And you can set exactly which apps you want your child to be able to use. You set up a password that they get in and out. It's your password, you know. It's a very straightforward way to set this up, but I really, really highly recommend looking at these accessibility options now that are offered through Apple. And we have some tutorials there you can check out. And the next slide as well. If you're not familiar with family sharing, I mentioned this earlier, you can set them up for your kids under 18, and they do have to get your permission to download things. You can set up app restrictions. You can set up certain protections. They have to ask you if they want to buy something. You do have to set up an Apple ID for each kid, but it's a really pretty straightforward, easy thing to do, and you're paying for it with your phone anyway. So I highly recommend you check it out. And again, Michelle will be sharing the deck, or Jaclyn, and it shows how to do this. These are very straightforward. If you just Google them online, you can figure out how to do them as well. So next slide. So we have so many resources for you, but we just wanted to give some space and time to see if anyone has any specific questions, or if anyone else on the panel wants to jump in as well too, or we can give you back 10 minutes to your evening. Does anyone have any questions they want to throw in the chat? Don't be shy. Or feedback.
I want to mention one thing that I heard recently. Late teens and early 20-year-olds, the newest trend is them watching videos of kids, like teenagers from the 80s and early 90s in school, not on phones. And they're just binging these videos, imagining what life would be like and what it could be like without their phones. So I find it fascinating that that's the draw now. So I think the pendulum is kind of going in the opposite way.
I agree. My 21-year-old said he will never give his children phones. My 21-year-old, but he was the one that you could.
Said that too.
Yeah.
The worst
Yeah,
thing.
Michelle, I mean, I think that's some of the most really striking data to see now is some of the studies coming out about yeah, teens, or I think the latest numbers I saw was like 18 to 27-year-olds, that generation now, but that wishing that some social media never existed. And some of those studies numbers are really striking to see, of people, young adults that have used them saying, I wish this didn't exist, or they wish that they hadn't used it. But the pull of the social component and feeling like they couldn't not, but it's really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Oh, I think the chat feature may not be working. So yeah, just drop. We would love.
I
Go
did
ahead.
see a hand raised. I think if you're able to drop your question in the chat, we can see who submitted it. We can address you by name. And that would be great. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And if there's more questions too, or options or ideas for new topics, we also would love that. So I think Wesley had a question. And then I did, just while we're waiting for that, Michelle did share that video with me. I did watch that on one of the TV shows where a mom was on a flight and she didn't want her child to be on a iPad, but the person next to them was watching something on an iPad, and the mom asked the other mom not to have their kid on the iPad, and they said no. And just sort of this interesting interplay that really fascinated me. I did watch that.
Yeah,
It's a
I
hard
found it fascinating. But also it just illustrates how we as parents are learning to navigate this as much as our kids are. That it's a learning process for all of us. So just have patience with ourselves and our kids. It's hard and it's a long game, like you said in the beginning.
Yeah, and it was just a question. Yes, we will definitely be sharing a PDF of the slides, so don't worry about that. And if there's something that we mentioned that you didn't feel we provided, just ask your team, because they are on it. They're awesome.
Jaclyn, did we hit all the questions that we had gotten?
Yeah, we did so far, and I believe we more or less covered the questions that came up in your registration. So thank you again for submitting those. We hope that this was at least a starting point to finding the answers you're looking for, and that we've pointed you into a few different directions where you can find more. Certainly reaching out to any of us for more support as well, and maybe talking to each other too.
Yeah, so I want to thank you all for being here. I think the biggest takeaway for me is always communication is key. And I think the tools that Common Sense has in coordination with what we're doing at Winston Prep just helps our families and us as teachers really structure those conversations to make it more concrete, because it can be so abstract. So the family planner that Common Sense has, that I think was on the slides, and a lot of the other tools are just, and the values piece of it just is a really nice way to structure those conversations and give you kind of that way to initiate it. I think is really helpful, but that communication is really key.
Yeah, and we're all in it together. I mean, nobody has this locked and loaded. It's very hard to do. So it's step by step, and as your kids, their ages and stages change, so will what's going on in your house and around media and tech. So thank you for letting me be part of this, and I wish you all a great rest of your night. I hope you get a lot of sleep.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.